The ledger. By the time Julia Diaz signed in for the night shift, rain had taped itself to the city like gray film. Saint Augustine smelled of lemon disinfectant and something older, polished brass, paper, the iron slick of memory. Her brother Martin lay in ICU. His voice on the phone had been paper-thin, trembling with an urgency that couldn't be explained by labs and vitals. There in the walls, he'd whispered, they call names. Hospitals kept ghosts in the neatest places. Charts, drive numbers, incident reports buried under executive hands. Julia had worked long enough to see how institutions tidy pain. She'd also learned to listen. The pipes hummed at St. Augustine like a chorus. Tonight they sounded less like plumbing and more like a throat clearing itself. Hargreaves, the night supervisor with keys on a chain and an expression older than his 30 years on staff, slid a manila envelope across the nurse's station when she arrived. If you cared to have uneasy dreams, he said without a smile. Inside, pages of a ledger, ragged at the edges, columns of names, admissions, transfers, discharges, precise, bureaucratic. Between the neat handwriting, darker annotations bled through, could not be located, missing after maintenance, and, written in a hand that tightened toward the back, the single word answered. A later note in Mary's shaky script said, sound beneath tiles registered, patients report names called, maintenance sealed south wing. No further action claimed by board. MB Mary Braddock, Julia asked. The name landed like a placard. Head nurse at the time, Hargreaves said, retired 2 weeks after that entry. They sealed the south wing after a fever outbreak years ago. Board rerouted pipework. Maintenance men came through once. 3 of them, Luis, Carter, O'Neill, and never came back. Tapes go dead at the door. Payroll dropped names. People make careers in tidy narratives. The ledger doesn't like tidy. Martin's hands trembled when she found him. His eyes were wide and too quick. They ask for names, he said when she sat. They sing. The pipes, if you listen, they say your name like a question. She wanted to file it as delirium, fever-lit projection. Medications scramble maps in the brain. But St. Augustine had an architecture of rumor. Staff stories folded into institutional silence until the lines between clerical mistakes and appetite blurred. It began in small ways. A nurse on nights quit after saying she'd heard her son called through tiles. A security guard fetched a water cart and never came back. The library's old attendance cards stored as historical oddities were found with new entries in a looping hand and stamped with answered. Near the sealed south wing door, someone had chalked a list of names, each marked with a tiny check or cross and a date. In shaky capitals at the bottom, do not answer. Julia's curiosity pushed her where her training would have advised caution. She used the access Hargreaves could not refuse to give to a night shift nurse, and told herself she'd document noises, get proof, call for engineering. She'd read the ledger. She'd made photocopies. That counted as due diligence. She found Aaron in the corridor, an intern, badge dangling, face as raw as new paper. He'd heard a voice in the vents calling his sister's name. Together, they went down the ramp to the sealed wing where tiles smelled of old water and the lights were sticky with time. The door was not locked. A key lay on the threadbare mat as if dropped in hurry. Someone had recently hammered nails into an inner door and rusted them in place. A charred finger-lettered message above the bed. We took what they said. The pipes lined the ceiling like a braided river. They presided over the corridor, their small clinks and long shutters threaded into syllables. At first the sound was plumbing, a patient's shower, the ventilation. Then, as if the building had decided to be articulate, it formed the cadence of names. Not all at once, one voice after another, patient and clear enough to make her scalp peel. Luis Ramos. A tile underfoot darkened like a wet thumbprint. The drain in the corner belched a little. The water turned from plumbing to speech. The list on the wall seemed to breathe. "Get out," Aaron said, eyes wide. But curiosity is sticky, and the corridor folded them inward. They followed its voice toward the nailed door. The nails gave at 3 strikes. The room inside smelled of stale soap and the faint perfume of someone remembered. On the floor was a damp outline, the negative trace of a person pressed to tile, and then pulled away an impression the room remembered. The pipes rejoiced with a wet little laugh. They were not the first to stand on the edge of whatever the hospital kept. Mary Braddock had written in the ledger, and then retired. Hargreaves had kept the ledger like a talisman he feared and needed. Ms. Ortega, a patient in room 12 whose skin was a map of veins, reached for Julia's wrist and asked, "Do you have a name?" "They only take those who won't say theirs. There are rules in hospitals and in life. Call a patient's name loudly before a procedure. Document an incident in triplicate. Do not let your personal feelings contaminate risk assessments." This was a case the books voted against. The ledger had no category for hunger that lived in tile. Still, rules bend. At the nurse's station, the intercom crackled with announcements while beneath it a voice that was not an announcement. "Return names like receipts." The ledger's margins seemed to rustle in Hargreaves' hands. Lines of ink were thin with panic. "They call names. We answer. We are safer when we don't." Someone had written "do not answer" in a hurried scrawl, and then circled it like it might be invisible. That night Martin's bed was empty. Monitors blinked a polite, lonely rhythm. The foreline dangled like a hand that had pulled away. Someone had moved his shoes, and a wet trail led toward the sealed wing. Aaron swore he had seen a shadow move down the corridor. Hargreaves' eyes closed at the thought. In the archive log, Martin's transfer read "transfer unknown." Julia should have called security. She should have posted an incident report and waited for daylight. Instead, she carried the ledger back to the nailed room, the pages whispering. She read names aloud, not in the clipped, administrative voice that ticked boxes, but in the slow, human way nurses read lists of admitted relatives so people have faces. She read maintenance men and patients, the women who'd turned to dust in rooms, and the children whose handwriting showed good days. She read before she had a plan, because sometimes telling the story of someone is the only way to argue for them. The pipes hummed a pleased, hungry tone and returned the names with a timbre that felt like listening. When the thing in the tiles addressed her by name more like a suggestion, something old in her, the part that remembers how to answer a mother from the sidewalk, pushed. She thought of Martin's hands and Mrs. Ortega's knuckle-like parchment. She thought of the ledger's annotations and Mary Braddock's line drawn through an entry, as if struck through with sorrow. Names were how people anchored one another. If the building wanted signatures, perhaps signatures could be traded. She took a pen. There is a small terror to writing your own name in a ledger that is not yours. The way graphite or ink feels like a declaration you cannot unsay. Still, She began with the maintenance crew and the patients she could not be sure were gone. The pen scraped like a small machine. Her hand shook. At the end she wrote, without thinking entirely, "Diaz, Julia." The pipes answered, and the sound seemed to come from inside her own mouth after it left the tiles. The voice that returned her name was thin and clear and somehow like a photograph of wind. It asked, gently, "Do you have a name for me?" She said yes. It was a small, decisive thing, and in the saying something unclenched. It was not a miracle nor a catastrophe. It was a settling, like pages arranged on a shelf. The wet outline on the floor darkened and then withdrew, as if a shadow found a place to stand and then chose, for the moment, to be elsewhere. Martin's bed remained made but empty. The old notes in the ledger took on a new sheen. Some crossouts had been smoothed into neat records. What the ledger recorded was not straightforward. It did not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it recorded attendance, or presence, or that someone had been marked in a way the building could understand. Answered could be a keeping, not always a taking. Sometimes it was a place to hold a small sorrow where it would not infect the rest. There were bargains, thin and brittle, struck in corridors by people who had to keep working and keep breathing. Names turned into tokens in those trades. Morning brought the board's bureaucratic calm. Dr. Park opened files with the practiced competence of a woman who kept pandemics in spreadsheets. Security footage was handled. Incident reports were consolidated. Hargreaves hid the ledger back under his papers as if returning it would make it less true. The keenness of fear did not disappear. Staff attendants steadied like a hand forced into relaxation. Nurses whispered solemn verses in patient rooms. A new memo forbade unscheduled access to the South Wing at night and redirected inquiries to a committee that liked the smell of conference room coffee. Mrs. Ortega was discharged against medical advice with a neat line on her chart. Aaron never came back to the hospital. His calls later were soft and full of thanks that sounded like incomprehensible payments. Julia did not vanish. The ledger bore her name in a small, clean hand: Diaz, Julia, near entries for Louise and Carter, and a child who had once learned to draw boats. Sometimes, when it thundered, the pipes would call a name, and it would be answered in a voice that sounded like her own. Hargreaves' ledger pages had changed. In the margins, new entries read less like inventory than like epitaphs. Dates of birthdays, small pleasures, the color someone liked. Once in a while, Julia would find a page where the word answered had been replaced by the scribble remember, as if someone had decided to teach the building a kinder word. The hospital learned to keep its liturgies. They held formal, supervised remembrances in the chapel with recorded names read into sealed mix and archived on a hard drive. The intercom's use was limited to script and emergencies. The staff adopted old habits as talismans, calling a patient's name before a procedure, writing next of kin in bold, saying a favorite food out loud to anchor someone who was slipping. These are small exorcisms. At night, Julia still walked the ICU halls. She ran her hand over folder tabs and, once, she pressed the ledger's edge and felt the ghost warmth where someone else's palm had rested. Sometimes, when the rain hammered like punctuation on the window, the South Wing breathed and a voice would shape a question like a hand. "Do you have a name for me?" She would not answer aloud unless she planned to write it down. If she did answer, she would do so with a sentence long enough to make any person recognizable. The color they liked. the habit that made them human, the small kindness they'd given in an empty corridor. She learned that names spoken with detail held less bait. They were stories, not signatures. There are people who say that a ledger light that will always hunger, that buildings do not learn compassion. The pipes remember every syllable, and sometimes they ask for what they need. But institutions make arrangements. Humans improvise. The hospital's ledger never stopped being a ledger. It still had the quiet, departmental inclination to count and store. The pipes still tuned themselves into voices when the night folded like paper. But where the ledger once insisted on names as tokens to be traded, it softened into something more like an archive, imperfect, necessary, dangerous. In the end, the ledger kept its pages. It kept entries that were taxes and entries that were prayers. Doctors and clerks argued over language. Counsel recommended euphemisms. Julia left the hospital months later with a resignation and a small box of photocopies she kept under her bed. She kept one thing the ledger could never quite claim: the way to call a name into being with more than hunger, a short paragraph that made a human being rather than an accounting entry. Sometimes, late at night, she would think she heard her name in the pipes and would press her palm to the wood of the stage, where Hargreaves might one day put the ledger on display. She would whisper a memory into the dark. Martin's laugh when he'd found a pigeon with a broken wing, Mrs. Ortega's stubbornness about green beans, the way an intern made a bad joke to quiet the fear. The building would listen, and on some nights it would answer with a gentler, almost apologies tone. On other nights it would not answer at all. The ledger remained, patient as a tide. It would take names when asked. It would be used as paper and ledger and remedy. People learned to close doors and to say full sentences instead of single words. They learned to keep their own lists at home and to teach children to write their names in ink and to say them aloud in the morning as if giving themselves permission to be found. And somewhere beneath the tiles, the pipes still remember every syllable. Sometimes, when no one is listening and the rain has stopped and the hospital's lights are kind and small, a voice will form a name and ask it like a question. If you are brave or tired or kind enough to answer, make sure you know how to speak someone into being, not into a ledger. To support this channel, please like this video and subscribe the channel.